Hey folks, I'm back with round 5 from the 2021 North American Open. So yeah, this was a pretty tough game. I was paired against WIM Alice Lee, who is of course a young junior, a really talented player. And this game was pretty interesting. It started off as d4 knight f6, and we quickly reached a mainline King's Indian position where white ends up going for bishop e2, the classical variation. I played knight a6 here. This is a move I like to play. It's pretty flexible. And here Alice went for bishop e3. So this is kind of like the Gligorich setup. I play e5, now white castles, and I go c6. And yeah, I've had this position a number of times. I think it's really interesting. Lots of ideas for both sides. Typically white plays d5 at this point to take some space, but there are other moves as well. But d5 I think has long been considered the main line. So knight g4, this is kind of black's typical reaction here as soon as white closes the center. Bishop g5, f6. Now white again has a choice, can drop the bishop back to h4, d2, or as we see in the game, bishop to c1, just to kind of stay out of the way. And this is a known idea, because black played f6. I don't really want to keep the pawn on f6 forever. I'm going to play f5 at some point. And then eventually white will take back the g5 square. Now this was an interesting moment because I prepared this position, and I know that generally black has two ideas. Black can either play c5 to immediately close the queen side, or black can play f5 here to keep the position more open. I think f5 theoretically stands a little bit better here, and typically white takes on f5, and we get something like bishop g5, knight f6, and I think, this position, very dynamic. White is certainly fighting for an edge here, but my opponent was playing quickly, so I imagine she had this well prepared, as well as the move c5 as well. So I started thinking, my plan initially was to play f5, and I think that position is fine for black. But then I was wondering, maybe I can come up with a different move here, and I realized maybe I should play this move king to h8. I saw that this was an idea against another option if white goes bishop d2 here. I saw that in this position some players were playing king h8 as kind of just like a clever little waiting move, not playing f5, not playing c5, not showing what we want to do. It never really makes sense for white to take on c6 because we just recapture with the pawn, and so it's not so easy for white to find moves in this position, because if white kind of messes around with their setup too much, well then black will play c5, f5, and might get an improved version. Because king h8 is a useful move in pretty much all these positions with f5 takes, where the g file opens up. So given that it's an idea here, I figured, well, if bishop c1 feels a little bit less active than bishop d2, I didn't really check it before the game, but it looked interesting, so I decided to play it, kind of put some pressure on my opponent, and force her to think on her own. And I think it was an interesting choice. I'm kind of glad I didn't check this one before the game, because if I did, then the engine would have told me that c5 is basically crushing for white, which I was not aware of. And that's the thing, when you prepare with the engine, a lot of times it like kills your ideas before you even get to the board. So had I checked this one, I would have seen that the engine thinks c5 is just winning, and then I would have never played it. But if you don't know this idea, and you don't know that it's good, it's not so easy to find this one. The point after knight takes c5, which looks like, would be the reaction, is that white goes b4, and the knight has to go back somewhere bad. Either d7, which blocks the queen and the bishop, and white will go dc, and this knight on g4 is potentially hanging. Or if knight a6, then white just takes on a6, kicks the knight with h3, plays dc6, and the position looks a little messy, but let's just say white is much better because of this d5 square. And yeah, it's not going to be super easy to pick up this c-pawn either. So objectively, king h8, very dubious because of c5. But over the board, so my opponent ends up playing king h1, right? She was spending some time here trying to figure out what to do. Because again, it's not an obvious position for white, right? If you don't know that the engine likes c5, it's not really a move. It's definitely a thematic idea, but it's not a move you would consider for very long. And during the game, I even looked at it. I was like, is c5 a thing? And it didn't look like anything special, right? So I didn't really pay a lot of attention to it. But now white is out of book, and she goes king h1, and I think this move already gives up the better part of white's advantage. Because now I play f5, and it's as if we had the same position. White goes e takes f5, g takes f5. So I could have played this move with the king on g8 and white's king on g1, but this inclusion definitely very favorable for black, because in all these lines, white is almost never playing king to h1, and meanwhile, black is almost always playing king to h8. So I felt like, well, this already worked out great. The opponent is out of book, and I feel like I have a nice position out of the opening. The other issue for white is that bishop g5 is now no longer so obvious, because the drawback of white's move king h1 is that this f2 pawn is a little vulnerable, and here black gets a second option to go queen to b6. Now, I'm not sure if I actually would have gone for this, because, okay, it's a nice double attack, but I'm not really sure I want to take that b2 pawn. White's always going to have like knight a4 and stuff, and like dc6 ideas, bishop to e7. But it's already a thing that white has to be concerned about, and my guess is white was a little bit worried about this one. I think actually instead black should just play bishop f6 and is doing fine, or even knight f6, but yeah, queen b6 is just kind of something for white to worry about. So instead in the game we saw knight to g5, I drop back, f3, and this is an interesting move. It kind of makes it harder for black to advance the pawns, but already here I was feeling very comfortable. Knight c7. Now my idea is just to slowly improve my position. I want to go queen e7, bishop d7, maybe at some point take on d5 and leave white with a kind of weak pawn there, and then play against the d5 pawn, maybe go h6, rook g8 at some point, and play on the g file as well. It seemed like a very nice and flexible position, so I was definitely quite happy here. In the game, white goes knight h3. I play queen e7, because anyway I'm going to play h6 at some point, and now white plays bishop to g5. I decide to kick the bishop here, and bishop h4. Now I finally take on d5, cd5, and I go queen f7. And I'm just lining up at this d5 pawn. White defends it, so the play here is actually quite logical. Bishop c4, bishop d7, threatening to play b5 now, which would be very annoying for white. So white goes a4. I played rook a8, just lining up the rook against the bishop. And now queen b3, not just defending the bishop, but also hitting b7. And yeah, this move was actually pretty annoying to deal with, because ideally I would rather just not touch the queen side at all. But now b7 is kind of hanging, and not exactly a pawn I can comfortably give up here. So I was choosing between rook b8 and b6. I end up going b6 because I figure if I play rook b8, white might play bishop f2, and then I might end up having to play b6 anyway. So I decided to start with b6. And now if white plays a5, then I have a nice trick with b5. Can't really take on b5 because we just get this pin on the b file, and white will lose a piece one way or the other. And then if the bishop drops back, then black plays a6, and I'm going to definitely win this d5 pawn. Maybe I can even take the d5 pawn right away. So instead we see knight f2. Actually, I think white spent quite a bit of time here. Now during the game, you know, I was really optimistic. I thought like my position's super good. I have so many options here. I have so many plans like rook g8, queen h5, knight h5, so many ideas. I can even maybe play on the queen side because white's bishop is on h4. Knight on f2 is not necessarily in the game. But this move actually, I think, takes things into a very interesting position. So I go queen h5. I thought this was critical, hitting the bishop, and this was white's idea because now the bishop is not coming back. Bishop g3, f4. So white's point was that she wanted to trade it off. And okay, at first glance, it looks like a huge concession. We got the dark squared bishop, and now this is such a powerful piece. And I pretty much just want to play like e4 in every single position. But here comes white's point, knight to b5. And I really underestimated this move when I went for all this, but still I think black is fine here. But the point is now white is trading a lot of pieces and creating counterplay, because d6 is hanging, a7 is hanging. And I looked at so many moves here just trying to make anything work because I didn't really want to exchange. But eventually I just figured like I just couldn't really find anything, and knight takes a7 is going to destroy the queen side. So I end up taking on b5. Bishop takes b5. Now white gets to trade off the bishop pair. I have to take, and a takes b5. And this move actually surprisingly threw me for a loop. I mean, it does feel obvious to open the a file for the rook, but I was actually expecting queen takes b5 because I thought that maybe white wants to keep the queen active so that the queen is always starting to infiltrate with like queen d7. White can still play a5 and open up the rook on the a file. Somehow I felt like this was more natural, and I spent most of my time kind of considering this position and what I was going to play here, because I didn't really want to go for all these trades without having a plan. And eventually I think I decided on playing e4 right at this moment, which I think is quite a strong move because it opens up the bishop to come to e5. And so I was thinking, for example, fe4, bishop e5, and okay, it's awkward for white to defend the mate, something like knight h3, And then minimum, I was thinking just like f takes c4, and the position looked beautiful to me, like bishop on e5, just so strong. And the e-pawn also actually pretty good too, and can easily start running like e3 and e2. So this position, I finally convinced myself I thought black was doing well. I have other options as well, like activating the rooks. And then my opponent played a takes b5, which, yeah, I just felt like wasn't as good. But I hadn't spent too much time considering what to do here. And at this point, we're like, yeah, move 27, we're starting to approach some time trouble. So the simple choice here for black would have been to just go rook f7, just defend the pawn. And I do kind of wish I just played this move. E4 now is not as good because white's queen is still in the third rank, so after fe4, bishop e5, minimum white can play queen to h3. And I was considering a lot of these endgames. I think a lot of the endgames are nice for black because of the bishop versus the knight, but it's not exactly what I wanted from the position. I was hoping for this like strong kingside attack, and now I'm not really getting it. Though maybe I should have gone for this as well. In the game, I play rook to g8, which was really just kind of like an intuitive sacrifice. I felt like, I just want to play for the attack on the g file, and I thought white could probably take on a7, but it looked really, really scary, so I wasn't sure if my opponent would do it. And yeah, what can I say? I mean, it was kind of like a semi-bluff, because I felt like intuitively black should have good play, though concretely I didn't know exactly what I was going to do on rook takes a7. I figured, let me just play this move, let my opponent think about it. If she wants to take the pawn, I believe in black's position, and I'll find something. And I don't know if this was the right approach to this position. In a different game, the move rook g8 might win very, very quickly, or this kind of sacrifice. I think I probably, given another chance, would have just wanted to play rook f7 just to keep things simple. I defend the pawn. I think in the game I was worried, white's going to challenge the c file, go rook c1, rook c6. But okay, anyway, I'm going to play rook g8, rook g7, and I don't think white will have a lot of time. And even if white does get counterplay, it's not nearly as fast as it happens in the game. Because that's the problem. After rook g8, rook takes a7, I don't find the right move here, and white ends up getting actually significant counterplay. I don't really care about the pawn. It's not about the pawn. White's b-pawns are doubled, so it's not like my e-pawn was ever going to go anywhere. But it's more that just like white's rook is now active, and white is able to get counterplay, and it's not so easy for black to set up the attack. So I considered a bunch of different options here. E4, for example, takes bishop e5, then again queen h3, and I wasn't sure. I do think black is at least fine in this endgame. I get rook c2, and everything is super active. White, threatening mate. White has to be super careful here. But this was one option, but yeah, I didn't know if it was going to be enough. I also considered just the immediate rook takes g2, which I thought was interesting, but the problem after rook g8 check, king h1, queen to g6, white does defend the mate with knight to g4, giving back some material. And here white is an exchange up. It does look like the king is weak, but I didn't think black had enough in this position. And in fact, black doesn't even really have a serious threat here, because gf3, white takes with the queen and covers all the key squares. So this one definitely wasn't working for black. And then I also thought about like queen g6 or queen g5 here, but then just g3. And yeah, somehow I thought like I should be able to break through here, but I really couldn't make anything work. Like if queen goes back to h5, then king comes to g2. Everything seems defended, and it's really hard for me to play a move like f4, because this will always allow white's knight the e4 square or the g4 square. So that wasn't working. I also considered bishop h4 for a while, because I felt like this move was very intuitive, threatening bishop takes f2, and rook c1, I have the back rank, and also threatening bishop h3, bishop g3, and forcing white to weaken the position. And this is where I think my calculation really got screwed up, because I definitely remember considering this one, and at some point I was thinking like, oh, even if I go bishop g3, then white has knight h3 and just defend. So bishop g3 is not really a threat, so bishop h4 maybe not such a good move. But I wasn't thinking about the position concretely, because I also thought like, oh yeah, also white can just play knight h3 immediately, and then there's no bishop to g3, and then I just kind of like discarded the whole thing without really taking a closer look. But as it turns out, actually after queen g6, black is just winning. It's like white can't defend the g-pawn. G3, bishop takes g3 is game over. If takes, queen takes, and white's position just collapses. And if rook g1 here, then just queen h5. This isn't hard to find, just hitting the knight, and white can't take on g3 without just losing. but something just went wrong. Like I was just a little bit indecisive here. And again, I had this thought like bishop h4. It's like, okay, I'm threatening bishop takes f2 and I'm threatening bishop g3. And then I'm like, oh wait, bishop g3, knight h3 isn't really a threat. But I mean, the knight is on f2. I'm threatening to just take this piece. so the knight needs to move. It's not like, white just does nothing and then I play bishop g3, knight h3. And so because I was like, I didn't see, oh, bishop g3 I can play. And then, I also thought, oh, maybe white can just go knight h3 right away. Then I was like, okay, this move is pointless. And yeah, I didn't like actually look at it and with like a serious, concrete mindset. So I ended up playing bishop g5. And my idea here is I want to go bishop f4. And I thought this was dangerous for white. If g3, my idea was to go bishop f4 anyway. And if white takes, then queen g6, and now white has to give back a piece to stop the mate. But material is equal here, and it looked like white's king was opening up. So I thought I had like really nice chances here. The rook c2 coming and so on. So g3 bishop f4, that looked like a nice idea to me. And then if king g2, I was thinking I could just start like building up like rook g6, or rook cg8, and looked like eventually I might be able to break through. I was also calculating this line quite a bit, but I wasn't sure if it was fully working. But it looked really interesting to me because white has to go knight to g4, and I think I was just going to take here. And I wasn't sure I'm down a rook, but I have a lot of checks against white's king, and it looked like a pretty dangerous attack. I actually didn't check this one with the engine, so let me just quickly glance. Yeah, engine says this one's not working, king f2, and white gets away. So yeah, I wasn't fully sure about this this sacrifice, but that was kind of one of the ideas. Of course, black has other options here. I can go like queen g6, for example, or stop doubling, or start doubling. But on bishop g5, white just goes knight h3. And now I don't really have a good follow-up, so I end up repeating bishop f6, and white doesn't have to repeat, but knight f2, I think white, it makes sense because it feels like white is under pressure. And now again, I have another chance to find bishop h4. I don't do it. This time I play rook to g6, and just kind of like a slow move doubling on the g file, but it's simply not fast enough. Queen a3, and now white is hitting the d6 pawn and threatening rook a8. And if white gets to trade off a pair of rooks, then it's like my pieces are on the king side, but they're not really going to be able to deliver mate, and I'm just going to lose on the queen side. So this is where I really start to kind of panic and regret my decision to sack the pawn, because I just didn't know what to do. If I go rook cg8, which looks supernatural, then I was thinking white just plays queen takes d6 here. Sorry, I forgot my calculations. And I can't take on g2 because queen takes f6. And I just couldn't find a move here. If bishop to g7, then like queen e7 or d7, I wasn't sure. And it's hard for me to do anything because of the mate on h7. So on queen a3, I end up going rook to c5. And okay, I was hoping for a little trick here. If knight to d3 hitting the rook, then rook to c2. And I'm actually threatening to play queen takes h2 check, followed by mate, which is kind of funny. Like, for example, queen takes d6, I can take here. And surprisingly leads to mate in both lines. King h1, just rook h2, rook g2. And if king h3, then rook h2 and rook g2. But okay, this is just a trap. Of course, white doesn't go for it. Plays rook a8 check instead. King h7, queen a7 check. And now the queen is infiltrating on the back rank. And at this point, I'm starting to wonder if I'm not like worse or lost because the queen is coming in and my king is in huge danger. Thankfully, things are kind of okay after rook g7, queen b8. I play queen f7, and I'm giving white the option to go queen h8 check king to g6. And I felt like my king was actually reasonably safe on g6, not perfectly. Of course, white could also just take on d6 here. And then I think white is better. I think rook f8 is threatened, so I have to go rook takes d5, queen takes b6, and it's two pawns. And I think it's not a huge advantage for white, but definitely white is better. I don't think black has enough for the material here, but it's also not like that obvious from white's point of view either. Like, black is still going to have some play on the king side. Actually, my opponent burned pretty much most of her time here and ends up going queen h8. Probably she thought queen takes d6 is also good, but she was playing for more here. Because after king g6, white goes g4. And indeed, this looks super, super scary for black's king, because white wants to take on f5 now and bring the knight to e4 or g4, and there's just tons and tons of threats in the position. So thankfully, I didn't lose this game. I ended up playing queen takes d5, which is the only move, hitting the f3 pawn. And I was feeling a little optimistic here, because if g takes f5, king takes f5, black actually has a ton of threats in the position. Queen takes f3, of course, is the main one. There's also rook g1 check, taking white's queen. And I spent a little bit of time calculating this position, because after knight e4, I actually thought it was pretty tricky. Because if I take the queen with rook g1, takes, bishop takes h8, I thought, to me, it looked really risky. Like, there's rook f8 check here, which looked really scary. And even if white just takes on h8, this position looked super dangerous for me, with my king in range of all of white's pieces. Maybe king f4 and I'm surviving or something, I wasn't really sure. But white can also throw in this one, which maybe is even more annoying. And then there's like rook g6 check, and yeah, so this looks super, super scary. But then I realized instead of rook g1, I actually have this move, queen to d3, which turns out to be really strong. Because I'm hitting the rook has to defend f3, but the rook also has to defend the back rank. Like rook f2, there's just rook c1 check. And I didn't see a way for white to defend here, and I think black is just winning. If knight g3, then rook takes. And engine confirms, actually, in fact, queen d3 is the only winning move, otherwise black is lost. So I was happy to see this one. And if knight g4, then I think I just take, and the pawn is pinned and the queen is under attack, and I can, like rook f8, I have rook g6, and that looked good to me. But instead, after queen takes d5, white plays queen e8 check, which I think is the only move. And originally, my plan was queen f7 here, but then I started thinking about it, because this is move 37. So I wanted to get to the time control. So I decided to repeat first, and then check, king g6, queen e8. But now I really have to make a decision, because king h7 is going to be 3-time repetition, and this is my last chance to play queen f7. At first I was going to do it, because I thought white has to take on f5, king takes f5. And if white trades queens and goes knight e4, then I thought black is totally okay, like maybe rook d5 here, and well, I think I have to play rook d5 to save the exchange, but I saw rook d5 and that would be enough. But then I realized takes, knight e4 is even more annoying, so without trading queens on f7. Because here it's not as easy for black. And also, if I play like rook d5 or something, then maybe white's not going to trade queens at some point and keep the queens on the board, and my king is on f5. So I just thought this was incredibly risky. So I could trade queens, and this was kind of my idea, to take, and after rook takes c8, black can also throw a knight takes d6, but actually wasn't afraid of this one, king f4, knight takes c8, rook g8 I have. And I thought, actually, if anything, my position is a lot more active, and I'm doing well in the endgame. But if white just recaptures, I actually had a real problem with this position, where if I could just consolidate, I think black would be doing great. But the rook is hanging, and d6 is hanging. But more than that, actually, white's other main threat is rook f8, which I just couldn't find a solution to. So, for example, rook d5, rook f8, I have to defend rook g6, and then just rook g1. Just trading off the rook, and I'm losing the bishop on f6, and to me it looks like I'm losing the game. And yeah, as it turns out, actually black is just lost after knight e4 here. So I'm very happy to have avoided this, and instead I came to my senses and decided just to repeat moves. I mean, I realized by this point things had already gone very wrong, and draw is definitely not a terrible result when you're playing with black against a very, very good player. So yeah, end up playing king h7, queen h8 check, and we agreed to a draw. Because neither side can really play on, I think, because both kings are in danger. f3 is hanging, and so white needs to give these checks. So yeah, the game ended in a draw. Very, very tough game. I had mixed feelings about it. I mean, after the game, I felt like I blew a big advantage, but objectively, actually, the one chance I missed was just this bishop h4 idea, which was kind of unfortunate. It's if you have a clear chance to win the game, then that would be nice to find. But I am happy that I didn't end up losing the game, because once things went wrong, things could have gone really wrong. And I've definitely lost a lot of these kinds of games where I'm doing well, I'm playing for the attack, but somewhere the attack doesn't work out, and then the opponent gets counterplay, and they end up busted. So I'm very happy I did actually hold the position and didn't end up losing, especially after queen a7 check, rook g7, and queen b8. I think black had to play really accurately here not to lose, with queen f7 being, I think, almost an only move, and then queen takes d5 being an only move, and then repeating. I know I easily could have gone for the endgame, just quickly play queen f7 here, and then for sure my opponent would have seen takes 94, and I probably would have ended up losing the game. So I am happy not to have completely blown it. Now I'm sitting on 3.5 out of 5. 4 rounds to go in the tournament, so anything can still happen. Definitely going to go eat and rest now, and yeah, hopefully I get some good games for the rest of the tournament. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next videos. Take care.